Okay, good morning or afternoon, everyone. On behalf of the Canadian School Board Association, I would like to welcome you to our Indigenous Trustee Panel entitled We're Ready Now, Let's Talk, Reflections from Indigenous Trustees. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that I'm joining you today from Ottawa, which is the unceded Algonquin territory. But because we're meeting both nationally and virtually, I would also like to acknowledge the First Nations, Métis, and Inuit lands that you are all on as well. So my name is Renee St, and I am Anishinaabe from the Chippewas of Rama First Nations, located in Ontario. I'm also the Acting Director of Education for the Assembly of First Nations and a board member at the CSBA. So today I will be moderating the panel. I would also like to acknowledge the work of the CSBA, our Indigenous Education Committee, the leadership of both the President, Laurie French, and Vice President, Carolyn Brody, as well as the Saskatchewan School Board Association for handling all the technical behind the scenes for this call today. So we have 4 panelists, and I've actually had the pleasure of working with 2 of them before in my job, and I'm excited to hear what they have to say on the questions. I think they're all extremely knowledgeable, very experienced, and very passionate about what they do. So our first panelist is Darren Googoo, and he is the former chair of the Cape Breton Regional School Board, former chair of the Council on Mi'kmaq Education, former chair of EdCan, and currently the director of education for Member 2. We have Barb Flett, who is born and raised in Île-à-la-Crosse and is fluent in Cree and Michif. He has been a trustee with the Île-à-la-Crosse School Division for 23 years. Barb has also been a board member of the Northern Teacher Education Program and the local community authority. Barb is a grassroots advocate. We have Peter Garrow, who is the former director of both the Akwesasne Mohawk Board of Education and the Assembly of First Nations, and presently the MCA's We Will Govern Program Coordinator. My apologies, Peter, my Mohawk isn't up to date, so I couldn't really say the Mohawk name. But Peter is also responsible for the self-government negotiation process between the Mohawks of Akwesasne and Canada. And last but certainly not least, we have Kimberley Greyeyes, who is a member of the Muskeg Lake Cree Nation and is an advocate for Indigenous children and youth, a trustee with the Prairie Spirit School Division, the Indigenous Constituency representative with the SSBA, and a former Human Resource Administrator and Director of Operations. So I wanted to welcome all the panelists today, and thank you for participating in this panel. I also want to welcome all of our participants. We're really excited about the conversation, and I think it looks like we have a great turnout. There's about 5 pages of us today, and it says about 76 participants. So thank you all for joining. The way that we're going to format the panel is we have developed a couple of questions that we're going to go through. I'm going to start off with the first question, and each panelist is going to have a chance to answer that. And then we have individual questions for each one of the panelists. We have left some time towards the end today. So if you have any questions that you would like to hear answered, please write them in the chat, and we'll be taking note of that and trying to consolidate some of the questions, and hopefully we have enough time to get to all of them, and if not, we might take those back and see if we can do this again some other time. So my first question, and each panelist will have about 2 minutes to answer this question, and I will let you know when your time is running up, because we only have an hour today, and I know we all have a lot of great things to say. So the first question is on tokenism. So tokenism is used to describe when an organization makes a symbolic effort of recruiting underrepresented groups to give the appearance of diversity, quality, and equality within a workforce. What have your experiences been with tokenism in a school board trustee setting, and how can we ensure to avoid tokenism? So why don't we start off the conversation with Darren Googoo.
I just got to unmute myself here. I think that tokenism is very prevalent in a lot of the institutions in Canada today. I know that in many ways, when I first started out as a board member in Cape Breton, Victoria in 2006, people weren't prepared. I think the board wasn't prepared for someone to come into the position or come into the conversation who was knowledgeable and passionate about First Nations education. So I think that took them a bit by surprise. And I think that they quickly learned that I wasn't there to be a token representative. And I think that's one of the key areas in which, if we're going to be successful in having our voices heard at a public level, we need to make sure that the people that we appoint, the people that we elect, the people that come into these positions of governance have the ability and the passion to speak intelligently and with emotion about the issues that affect our First Nations children. So I think that the first way to combat tokenism, and the most effective way, is by having an effective representative and someone who's able to articulate our views and to be passionate about the issues that they believe in.
Great, thank you, Darren. Barb, did you want to provide your input on tokenism?
Sure. On a local level, we don't experience tokenism. Our board and community are predominantly Indigenous, but out there, provincially and even nationally, like there was, on a personal level, there was this one experience that I had going to a conference where I was asked to accompany a person to pick up a keynote speaker at the airport. And I was kind of unsure, and I didn't ask why I was picked, but I assumed because he was Indigenous and I was Indigenous, and then it felt like on a certain level like I was being used, and it really didn't sit well with me. And with all due respect, this panel could very well be seen as tokenism unless there are actions taken to address the issues discussed today. This is simply another example of Indigenous voices providing the illusion that we're being heard. But until this advice is taken, understood, and practiced, this will remain tokenism. So my hope today is that this conversation, our participation in this session, and this input will create positive impact. And boards and organizations can tell people that they value them till they're blue in the face, but until someone can say, I feel valued, then tokenism is all we'll ever get. So as an example, back in the day when I first started on the school board, it was over 100 boards in the province of Saskatchewan. And when we went south to go to meetings, we weren't even, we were just there, let's say. We were part of the 100 and some school boards, but I didn't feel like we had a voice. And now that we're, with all this Indigenous stuff going on and wanting to be included, I feel like we're more part of the picture now, when people look up to us to help them with issues or whatever. And I mean, it's not to say that we all know every Indigenous issue, because sometimes we're painted with the same paintbrush, and we're all diverse and have different values and different structures and that kind of thing. But that's just something that I've experienced.
Thank you, Barb. I think those are really important points. And I think, everyone is listening when they hear that. So or I at least hope everyone's listening when they hear that. So thank you for that. Peter, did you have something to add on the question of tokenism?
Yeah, Sego, everyone. David, I see you there, and I see Mike, Brant. Nice to see your faces, and a few other people, I think some of them, but I know. But anyway, no, I will. Tokenism is a tough one because as a trustee for Upper Canada District School Board from Akwesasne Mohawk Board of Education, I was there for a little bit over 10 years, but I also chaired the Indigenous Council of Trustees for Ontario. And when I first entered the position as a trustee, of course, question was asked, okay, do you represent the Mohawks of Akwesasne? I represent our school board. And I want to represent the school board in a way that it also exemplifies what our students, what our teachers, what our needs are, and even the board members from our local school board. Because you have to understand, from my perspective, when I first came on, that there really wasn't a role. I mean, we're latecomers to the whole system of education, of Indigenous education. And it's only through because we had a tuition agreement that we had to negotiate that we put in the clause that there has to be a trustee. And so you wonder, okay, well, this is coming about. Okay, we are in an agreement, but it was financial because in negotiating a tuition agreement, the federal government was very happy to say, okay, we're going to fund per student what a certain amount of dollars that will go to whatever school board it is. And it was significant because when I looked at it, and of course, coming from Akwesasne Mohawk Board of Education, I knew what the funding was for our own individual students. And the amount that was given to our local school board for those education services was a lot higher. So I had to go, what is going on here? Plus, it was a one-way ticket. It wasn't reciprocity in the sense that we had students who lived in Cornwall who were getting education services in our schools. But again, it wasn't reflected that we would get the same amount of dollars that the federal government was paying to a provincial school board. So there was a little anomaly. So I needed to understand that. And as a trustee, I was able to raise that. But I also have to say that because of it, we have come a long ways. I think in the modern school system, because of right now, when you talked about, Renee, when you gave the greeting of traditional territory, that's happened because we had ministers of education from Ontario coming to our sessions. We also had the former Premier, Kathleen Wynne, come to our thing, and they started doing the traditional openings. So we made a difference, and it took a while for people to understand that, you know, we can be as diverse, we can be of value to a school board, not just for the funding purposes, but also talking about how we can be in a competitive nature of raising our standards and our system based on whatever we can get as far as training, tools and that with school boards. And Ontario School Board Association was really helpful in trying to advance that. We also had, I was also the director on the Ontario Public School Board System, which again, I think was very profitable. And it's only in the modern times that we've been able to reach that level. We probably still have a long way to go, but at least that helped. And I think everything that came about from Truth and Reconciliation, UNDRIP, and everything else really helped us as well. So my experience as a trustee was really well taken. And plus, I had to go back to, of course, to my own school board and report on how we're doing, talk about the tuition agreement, because I was there primarily to monitor how funds come down and how we are able to put into our agreement a sense of reciprocity. So that's come a long ways. That's it. Thank you. Meow.
Thank you, Peter. And over to you, Kimberly.
Thank you. I just want to say I'm very humbled and thankful to be put on a board with Peter, Barb, and Darren. I was reading their bios, and Barb I have met before, and to be sitting on a panel with such knowledgeable and educated people is I'm very thankful. Tokenism, in my experience, is very prevalent. It is getting better. It's a slow process. When I was first elected as a trustee, I was straight out told by one of the chiefs, it's a token position, you'll never get anywhere with it. And this is just our reality. But that leads into, how do you avoid tokenism? I came to make myself realize, number one, I did my best to learn the processes and the governance of a provincial school board. That was not my area of specialty, was provincial school board governance. So first thing I did was I learned it. The second thing I did was I made myself, first of all, understand I have a voice and it's time to use it. The second thing I did, my vote counts just as much as the next person, and I made it count. This last term was my first term as a trustee, and I've made it work. I've made it count, because our children, I don't want them growing up the way we did. We have to come to realize too, we have the advantage here. We were all brought up and taught in the non-Aboriginal way. We understand their governance. We've been taught in school. So whether we see it or not, we do have an advantage here. We have come to understand the way of non-Aboriginal people. And yet we understand, thankful to my grandparents, my Kukum, my late Mushum, I also understand our culture and our traditions. So I've brought up my children and my grandchildren to do the best they can to walk in both worlds. And we can excel at this if we understand that our voices count and our voices need to be heard. So as a first term trustee here, just because I'm very thankful for the support I get from the people around me, I've made it count, and I've made it to the SSBA as part of the Indigenous constituency representative with the SSBA. I'm the first Indigenous woman to sit on that seat. The very first thing I do, though, is I'm always looking, I listen to the people who have been there before me. What went right, what went wrong. The only way we can stop tokenism is if we say, that's it, we refuse to be, we won't be held as tokens any longer.
Thank you, Kimberly. And thank you all for your answer on that. I know as a First Nations person, myself, we often feel tokenism in anything we do. So it's really important for me to hear other people's experiences. And I think it's important for non-Indigenous people to know and hear that as well. So our first individual question, Darren, this one is directed at you, and it's on school representation. So you have 5 minutes to answer this question. Why is it important for school boards to have representation reflecting the diversity of students and families that it serves?
Hi, Renee. I just can pull over and go back on mute here. I think it's important. I was an appointed school board member in Nova Scotia at a time in 2006. I think one of the challenges was that when we had school boards, we didn't have Aboriginal representation. We didn't have First Nations representation. And when the legislation changed and allowed for First Nations to appoint school board members as full school board members in their local areas, it changed the nature of the game, because prior to that, our concerns were only heard when we had a chance to speak in meetings with the province. There was always adversarial. It was us versus them. And when we had a voice at the school board level, you're part of a school board team, you're part of a decision-making body, you're part of the governance structure of that board. And that makes a huge difference, because you're picking up the phone and you're able to influence decisions on a daily basis. You have a responsibility as a board member to policy. You have a responsibility to equity and fairness. and you can ensure that those things are followed up on. I know from a local, the role that came with being appointed, for us, it was threefold. Number one, I was able to represent my community and the community of Eskazoni and Wagmatcook on the local Cape Breton Victoria Regional School Board. So I was able to do that. So when we had concerns from our communities, whether it was the treatment of a student, whether it was the policy and how it disproportionately affected our students, we're able to have that conversation as a governance and a policy making thing at the local level. So we can meet with the superintendent, we can meet with the program people, we can do all of those things and have conversations that we hope will lead to a better outcome for our First Nations students. That's the first thing. The second thing that happened when we had the appointed school board structure in Nova Scotia was it led to the creation of what's known as the Council on Mi'kmaq Education. And this council in Nova Scotia consisted of all of the school board members that are First Nations that are appointed and representatives from various First Nations organizations to guide the government. So really it gave us two voices, one at the local level, one at the level of the school board. But it also gave us an opportunity to interact with members of the Provincial Department of Education. And it gave us an opportunity to have their ear. And so we met with the deputy minister, we met with the director of Mi'kmaq services. We got an opportunity to meet with the various government, the various government employees that had a say over public education in Nova Scotia. And so it created a secondary level of voice for us. And then the third thing that it really did was it allowed us to have, because under our guidelines for our Council on Mi'kmaq Education, we had an opportunity as a council to meet twice a year directly with the Minister of Education in Nova Scotia. So what that allowed us to do was to have that voice directly into the minister's ear. And so if we had direct concerns, and we provided, every year we would provide a letter to the minister around the things that we saw as fundamental changes that needed to be made, not just in our local school board, but across an entire system in Nova Scotia. And we were fortunate because our role was able to evolve, and that we were actually able to meet with several departments, including adult education, the Minister of Labor and Advanced Education in Nova Scotia, and we were able to meet with the Premier several times in the course of meeting with the government officials. So we were able to have a larger impact. Unfortunately, in Nova Scotia, one of the unfortunate things is school boards were eliminated 2 years ago. And with the elimination of those school boards, we lost our very valuable voice at the local level. It's been replaced with local Mi'kmaq coordinators in every board. But those local Mi'kmaq coordinators in those boards, they're employees of the board, and so they don't have the same ability to speak to our issues as First Nations the way we would, because we're not employees of the board. So I think that that's been a really important part of the equation about representation, is making sure that we had voice. And, you know, for us, we had 3 levels of voice. We had the local governance structure, which was the school board. We had a strong voice there. We had a voice with the Department of Education, and through the people working in the department on our behalf. And then thirdly, we had a political voice, because we got to meet with the ministers and the Premier twice a year to talk about greater issues that are above the school board. So they were able to direct. So I hope that answers the question.
Thank you, Darren. I think the situation that you described, especially with Nova Scotia eliminating school boards, is really important, but to see your involvement on the different levels. The second question kind of builds off of that, but it's flipped. And this question is for Barb. It's also on representation. But Barb, I know your school board is slightly different. So what have your experiences been in an Indigenous run school board? And have there been certain assumptions made about you, maybe within the school board or more widely when you work with other school boards or school districts?
Yeah, our school division, I'll give you a little bit of history of how we became our local, we were able to take over our local school board. There was, in 1974, there was a sit-in, and people wanted to be autonomous. They wanted their own local school division. And so we fought for it and we got it. And so there's a long history there. There's a strong historical base, and we have good leaders, and we stand up for them and move forward in strength for the students. My cat's trying to get in the picture here. Anyway, so when we locally, our school-related matters are dealt with in a timely fashion because, you know, we're here, and we have like I said, we have a school-based autonomy, and we have a close relationship with the director. We're voted in from the community. We represent our constituents, and we can respond within, you know, a timely manner for issues that come up. We can work towards our weaknesses to address issues quickly with resources and now with our immediate environment, and we can include priorities such as learning off the land. We don't have to explain why, we just do it because of who we are. You know, we're a Métis community. We have our own language. We're collectively connected and supportive of who we are in language and culture. We can proceed with the distribution of funds and prioritize our deliverables. Contracting for services can occur quickly because we only have 2 schools within our school division. We have our board is like all Aboriginal, and so all our issues we deal with in our school division are local, and so we can deal with that quickly. And what was the second part of that question? Again, sorry.
The second part of the question was that, do you feel that there's been any assumptions made about you being from an Indigenous school board, perhaps when you meet with other school boards or other districts?
Sometimes, like when we meet, we're asked a question, and it's like we're answering questions for all Indigenous people. And I mean, not understanding, I guess, that everyone has their own views, challenges, and experiences and strengths. And so they assume that every Indigenous person has the same list of problems or whatever, or things that they have to deal with. And I think going back to that question, I'm sorry, I'm losing my train of thought. I'm so nervous. Assumptions made.
I think
I'll just pass on that one. Sorry.
I think you touched on it a bit when you spoke about tokenism. How because you were the Indigenous person, it was assumed that you would just get along with another Indigenous person and go to often I know we have assumptions like that made about ourselves, and you just a little bit too.
Well, it's like because we're Indigenous people out there, people assume that we're all speaking for all Indigenous people. You know, we're, like I said, we all have different views, challenges, experiences, and strengths, and we're in the North, and I think sometimes there's not enough value placed on Aboriginal or Indigenous people because maybe some of us have low education or we're just looked at in a lower kind of rung on the ladder. And so I think our voice needs to be heard, and people need to value what we, our experiences too. So anyway, I hope that answered that question.
Thank you, Barb. I think that was great. And I mean, it's something I can definitely relate with. I work for a national First Nations organization, and often we get questions that are pan First Nations, but we're all very different people. So, and our experiences are all very different. So thank you for that. And I think, building off of kind of what you said and how people will ask us questions and expect us to know the answer being an Indigenous person, that leads into our next question for Peter, and it's on anti-racist education. So the question is, what is the importance of anti-racism education for students, staff, and trustees? And how do you see anti-racism education being taught?
When this subject came about, it was a little difficult because racism is still with us. I mean, it's evidenced by just the death of Joyce Echequan at the Joliet Hospital and the racial slurs that she had to endure while dying. And of course, everybody has seen what happens to George Floyd, and his death. And the whole movement, I guess, for Black Lives Matter. And so I had to deal with that. And I'm just thinking about our own history, if you want, because when you talk about racism, what about Indigenous lives? We matter as well. And you have to historically look at when, not to take away from what Black Lives Matter is, because these people came as slaves, but we predated them. Because when the early colonizers came over to North and South America, there was estimated 100 million of us occupying these two continents, Turtle Island. And it was just amazing that because of greed, if you want, we were the first slaves. But because of disease, wars, cruelty, we were sort of almost eliminated and reduced to probably 10 million people in both continents. And that has been a problem. And of course, then you kick forward, I guess, to the deadline of, let's have an Indian Act after Constitution in 1867. We've endured the Indian Act for 144 years, but we survived. We're survivors. We were confined to small little plots of land. We had to endure, of course, residential schools, Indian day schools, sometimes probably very poor health services. And a lot of the rules, because of the Indian Act, were enforced by RCMP. But people have to understand that there's still racism, because it still exists. And in some institution it's there. So we have to let our students know, we have to let our teachers know, we have to have an education system that says, okay, if it's there, then what do we do? But in some institutions, probably you could look at it. But if it's in people, that's a tougher task. And so you really have to start to say, okay, if it's there, then how do you sort of get out of it? And I guess the focus has to be bringing it up to modern day, is that we have to know our history. We have to know our tradition. We have to know our spirituality. We have to know if you want, our whole relationship with the land, with the environment, and all of that. And we have to instill that. We have to put it in our curriculum, that these are meaningful values and contributions of our people into the system, so that we're recognized. We're not looked upon as being inferior. You have UNDRIP, you have Truth and Reconciliation. You have all the studies that are going around and people talk about the doctrine of discovery and everything like that. That's history. That has to continue in many, many conversations and that to sort of get an understanding and at least give the respect of us. When I was teaching, and especially with adult educators that I had had various conferences with and that, and when you're talking to mature students and that, a lot of them had gone through some really tough lives, but when you see down to the point, they made some really good decisions because they're back into the system. And I always tell them, if you have children, or even if yourself, if you want to, we need our own environmentalists. We need our own ethno-historians. We need all the ologies, archaeology, geology, anthropologies, biologists. We also need people in finance. That's how we start changing, getting our people into those mainstreams. Sort of to start trickle down, if you want, the whole body of racism that's there. And in doing so, people will start to understand us better, because spiritually, I was raised Roman Catholic, and even under being raised Roman Catholic, it was always taught that mankind is above all things. But in only dealing with elders, and I find that I'm becoming an elder very quickly, but they don't accept me because they think I'm too immature. But that's another point. But talking to the elders, they're saying, you know what? When we do the Thanksgiving address, which we've done at the Ontario Public School Board for many meetings and that, even within our own, and our schools open with Ohanda Galiwadekwa, which is our Thanksgiving address, giving thanks to all of creation. We're part of it. We're part of the whole ecosystem. And that's a big difference. And I think that's one of the things that we could still bring to the whole education system. Because if you look at where we're going right now, globally, it's a tough situation. All of us are I guess, boxed into it as well. We're going to pay for that. So really, it's there. And I think that as we get more of our people, because as we survived, and all of these other studies that have been gone on, the various recommendations that governments had put forward to us, the change in curriculum, and especially during COVID, I think this is a great opportunity if we can start putting on more videos such as this that reach as many people as we can to talk about what we've gone through, but also to raise the level that we're here. And to be here, we also need to be recognized. And our history in many, many areas has to be taught. And so with that, I want to thank also, everybody for listening, because it's been, I keep probably repeating it everywhere I go on the importance of what we can provide to the education system, and especially to our youth. Because when I deal with non-Indigenous youth, and I tell them about what happened during residential schools, when I tell them what the Indian Act's all about, when I tell them about colonization and everything, they go, wow, how come we don't know this? How come we don't, where is this? How come we're just only learning about it now? And that's a product, if you want, I hate to say that, but it's probably a product of racism. Okay, thank you very much. Now.
Thank you, Peter. I think everything you've said is so important, but also particularly in the climate that we're in and everything we see going on. And it is very much here in Canada with First Nations, Inuit, Métis people. And, we don't often see that recognized through a lot of lenses. So thank you for your words on that. The next question I have is for Kimberley, and it's it's a threefold question, and it's on student representation. So do you feel it's generally assumed that you speak for all students or that you only speak for Indigenous students? Alternatively, do non-Indigenous trustees speak for Indigenous students? And going kind of back to what Peter was talking about, should inclusion anti-racism PD be mandated for all trustees?
We just had to save that one for me, hey? Well, thank you. One of the biggest things I wanted to say is I agree with Peter. We are survivors. I am a 4th generation residential school survivor. We've come a long ways. As for the questions here, Barb, I want to thank you for your words as well. You had a lot of great things to say, and I truly appreciate that. In regards to, do you feel it's generally assumed that you speak for all students or that you only speak for Indigenous students? Quite honestly, when I first started this, yes. And quite honestly, I had to understand that as well. I did go to the board table when I first started thinking I'm here for just our students. But I also like to have a little bit more open-mindedness. As I moved along, I'm there to represent all students. We started a process and agreements with the local school board, with our First Nation, where through the ISSI agreements, we have what's called a cultural cabin out here that is accessible to the provincial school systems. Therefore, not only are the students from the off-reserve or off First Nations schools coming out here, they're learning about our cultures, our traditions, learning about our histories the way we've been taught them. But we are also going to the provincial schools because our school here only runs from Head Start to grade 7. So then they're moved into the provincial school systems. And we are also learning about the cultures that are within our area, which I think is also very important. So do I think I'm just here to represent our own students now? No, I'm not. And I am just as capable as the next trustee to speak. Actually, I have to take that back, and I know, and I truly hope this is not meant in an offensive way, but I can quite honestly represent all students. Do I think that other trustees that are non-Aboriginal can represent Aboriginal students? There are some, yes. But on average, I'm going to say it's very challenging for them to do that because they don't understand our cultures, our ways, our traditions, and our stories. We have spent lifetimes learning about non-Aboriginal cultures, religions, politics, governance, everything. We had, for myself, thank goodness for my parents, they had started back on our own cultural ways. So at least I had a start. My grandmother was a very, very rigid Catholic woman that, you know, there was just no other way. My parents chose to do things a little differently, and I've chosen to do things even more differently, where I have taken it upon myself to learn everything I can, to listen to my elders, to speak with my elders, because this is our way. I always feel that by teaching our students how to be proud of who they are, we wouldn't face so many of the challenges that we do. Instead of always walking with their heads down, I want to see our children walking with their heads up and being proud of who they are. By educating them, and not only them, but all students and their teachers and the school board trustees, will get further ahead. Maybe then we're not so willing to feel like we're being talked down to and that we still need to learn so much, or we're not entitled to speak up. This is why I keep going back to using our voices. Our voices are here to use. We are strong enough. We've proven that for how many generations? We're survivors. Next part of this was, do I feel that they speak for that non-Indigenous trustees speak for Indigenous students? I've met a few that are absolutely amazing. They've taken it upon themselves to learn about our histories, to talk to us, if they've got a question, so many of the non-Indigenous trustees will come and they'll ask me, because I feel like I'm a very approachable person. If you don't understand something, come and talk to me. Don't make assumptions. I didn't make assumptions when I was learning European history. I didn't make assumptions when I was learning non-Indigenous politics and governance, because I have worked for a lot of Indigenous workplaces in my past. And this leads right into, should anti-racism and PD be mandated for all trustees? On the downside of things, I've run into a lot of different situations where, quite honestly, yes, unfortunately, mandated is going to have to be the word to use. Would they learn willingly if it was optional? I don't think so. And it's simply because it's like when I used to work right in the office doing HR, just because that's the way things have been done all these years does not necessarily mean it's the right or most accurate way to do things now. Things change all the time, and people become so ingrained in their habits and in their routines that they don't want to learn a new routine. They don't want to learn a new way of thinking. And it's time that minds, if it has to be mandated, then yes. Quite honestly, I've had comments like the misunderstanding that when we talk about, like, we're working on the 4 Seasons of Reconciliation PD, we are 2 nations. There's people that don't understand that. Up until recently, according to the Indian Act, we weren't even recognized as human beings. And now when it's not wanting to learn or having to put yourself, because it's an uncomfortable topic. But we're finally, at least, and I see us moving forward because we're finally getting to these hard topics. We're finally having these tough conversations, and they are tough conversations. How do you say things in a non-offensive way? I don't want to be that person that people avoid because I speak too harshly or because I am not willing to listen. My grandparents, my kukum and my mushum, one of the biggest things is, and that's something that we could all take, and this is a teaching. You go to the board table to hear and listen. You go to your community that you represent to listen. You don't listen to answer. And my kukum was, you're too busy talking, you're not learning anything. So do I think we have to mandate anti-racism PD? I do, unfortunately. Although I will not paint everyone with the same paintbrush, like what is done. And quite honestly, in a lot of cases, it's done to us. I'm very fortunate. My mother's Sioux, my dad is Cree and Soto. And so I've been privileged enough to learn about each of those, and I'm not going to say in total, I don't have every answer by any means. But unfortunately, there are a lot of people out there that think, well, we have an Indigenous trustee sitting at our table, and this goes for a lot of organizations, not just school boards. I'm not painting this just with the school boards, but it's just like you're supposed to know everything Indigenous, and I don't. I've got so much learning left to do. I have grandchildren, but that doesn't make me an elder. I have knowledge, but I still have so much to learn. And I think we all do. And I think in light of the calls to action, we have no better time than right now to have our voices being heard, to speak up, to finally say those things that need to be said, to have those tough conversations, to represent our children, and have our children grow up differently than we all did. I grew up being taught to be ashamed of who I was. Every time, in any history book you look, every time the Aboriginals won, it was a slaughter, and when the non-Aboriginals won, it was a victory. I don't want my children learning that. I don't want anybody's children learning that. I don't want us to have to still be having these conversations in 50 years from now. How do we get over racism? I've taken the time all my life to learn about non-Aboriginal culture, everything. when is it time? And there's always going to be a gap until everyone realizes that has to be met both ways. And it's not up to just because we have one Aboriginal at the table that we're covered. I've known people that have taken it, that are non-Aboriginal, but have taken it upon themselves to learn about our culture and to take that walk. And I think it's time a lot of people took that walk. We took that walk for the last 150 years. And I don't mean to come across as harsh. I'll take that walk with you. If there's anything I can do to help, I will always do that. Because all I want is a better life and a better future for our children so that they're not walking with their heads down.
Thank you, Kimberly. You know, I think we've touched on a lot of important topics today, and representation is so important. As I've mentioned, I work for the Assembly of First Nations. So when we do our work, you know, we have about 32,000 on-reserve students who attend provincial schools. And, you know, that's not counting some of our off-reserve students. So when we're looking at representation, it's important to engage our Indigenous people, to have them at the table and have meaningful conversation. Recognizing that we only have a couple of minutes left, I did want to ask just if maybe the panelists could, in one sentence, kind of state what's one thing that you see that needs to be the biggest change in the system today. I know it's a big question, but if you could kind of picture that in one sentence, that would be great. So maybe quickly we'll go back to you, Kimberly.
I was hoping to be last on this one.
I just noticed Darren was still driving, so.
Well, you know, actually the one thing that I think needs to be changed, open your eyes, be willing to learn and be willing to listen. This is not a competition. It's all about education. It's all about learning. And things and times have changed.
Thank you. Peter?
Good question. I think that Indigenous trustees, probably because we have two communities, they should be bridges between the communities they come from, who they represent, and also to the school boards, and both provincially and also nationally to the Canadian School Board. We should be bridges, not just a faucet for flowing money. And I just want to reiterate that because that's how it started. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. Barb, in one sentence, what would you change?
Values. I think as Aboriginals, we need to feel valued. We need to feel like we're a part of this whole scheme of things. We need to be a part of the picture. And, you know, we need to keep on raising our voice and take up space to be heard. And taking up space as an Aboriginal person, as an Indigenous person, and making space for Indigenous people is so important. You know, it's knowing and expressing the value of Indigenous voices and input to be part of building a more inclusive and respectful environment for those that'll follow us, you know, that'll truly benefit the students and communities. Sorry, that wasn't one sentence, but.
No, thank you, Barb. And finally, Darren, what would you change?
I think that the one change that I'd like to see in governance structures, in education across this country, and this goes for First Nations school systems and First Nations school boards. I think when we talk about change, when we talk about a need to include our children, a need to make sure that the system works for them, I think the biggest change we need to make is to commit to making that change deliberate. It needs to be a deliberate change. We just can't hope for a better system for our children We need to have concrete actions so that we can create the kind of world that we want. A good example for that would be, for many times I've heard as a school board member, we need more First Nations teachers. Well, we can hope for that all we want. But if we don't make deliberate change to recruit, retain, and hire, if it's not deliberate, it still won't happen. So I guess for me, the single biggest change that we can make is by being deliberate change makers.
Thank you. So that brings us to the end of our panel. I wanted to say a big miigwech to all the panelists and everyone for joining. But I would also like to challenge you all. So I think what we heard a lot today is, you know, we're not making a change, and it is still tokenism if we're not providing deliberate action to change our outcomes. You know, and we have all of our panelists today are very experienced and have lots of knowledge around the subject. So I challenge everyone who's listened to this today to go make a difference and take this back and make the change that's necessary. So thank you to everyone.
No.
Thank you, Renee, for allowing us to be on the panel.
Drive safe, Darren.
Thank you, Renee.
Awesome.
Thank you. Thank you to all my
Thanks,
fellow
everyone.
panelists.
Thank you, Renee.
Thanks, Renee, and everyone. Be safe, and as we say in Mohawk Skana, peace to everybody.
And nice to see you again, Peter.
Thank you, everyone. Willie, good to see you. Peter, take care.
Take care, Peter.
All survivors.
Bye, Nancy.
Bye, Darren. Thank you.